knocked over a glass. She had spilled juice on her mother's dress once. She had done a lot of things over the years that she wasn't supposed to. She remembered all of them, knew what they were, and she tried hard not to do them again, but she couldn't help it. She didn't want to upset anyone, didn't want her mother to be mad at her. She didn't mean to get dirty or drop things on the floor or forget her hat in school. They were accidents, she always explained, her huge eyes imploring her mother for mercy. But somehow, no matter how hard she tried, the wrong things always happened. The thin high heels walked past the closet again, more slowly this time, and Gabriella knew what that meant. The search was ending. She had narrowed it down to the last of the hiding places, and it was only a matter of time before her mother found her. The child with the huge eyes thought of turning herself in. Sometimes her mother told her that she wouldn't have been punished if she'd been brave enough to do that. But most of the time she wasn't. She had tried it once or twice, but it was always too late by then, her mother said. If only she had confessed earlier, it would have been different. It would all have been different if Gabriella behaved properly, if she answered when she was spoken to or didn't when she wasn't, if she kept her room clean, if she didn't push her food around on her plate and let the peas fall over the edge until they left grease spots on the table. If only Gabriella could learn to behave, speak only when spoken to, and not scuff her shoes in the garden. The list of Gabriella's failings and transgressions was endless. She knew only too well how terrible she was, how bad she had been all her life, how much they would love her if she could only do what they told her to, and how much they couldn't because of the constant grief she caused them. She was a bad child, she knew, a sad disappointment to both of her parents, and that pained her greatly. Knowing that was the crushing burden she had carried throughout her short existence. She would have done anything to change that, to win love and approval from them, but so far she had done nothing but fail them. Her mother made that clear to her constantly, and the price Gabriella paid for it was the constant reminder of her failings. The footsteps stopped outside the closet door this time, and for a brief moment there was an interminable silence before the door was suddenly yanked open. Light filtered back into the bowels of the closet where Gabriella hid, and she closed her eyes as though to shield herself from it. It was the merest crack of light reaching toward her through the coats, but to Gabriella it felt like the bright sunlight of exposure. She could smell her mother's perfume heavy in the air and sense her closeness. The rustle of the petticoats her mother wore were like a warning sound to Gabriella. And then slowly the coats were pushed apart, creating a deep canyon leading straight into the back of the closet. And for a long, silent moment Gabriella met the eyes of her mother. There was no sound, no word, no exchange between them. Gabriella knew better than to explain, to apologize, or even to cry. Her already too big eyes seemed to outgrow her face as she watched the inevitable rage grow in her mother's eyes, and with a single superhuman gesture her mother's arm lunged toward her, grabbed her by one arm, yanked her off the ground, and pulled her forward with such speed that the air seemed to leave Gabriella's lungs with a small whooshing sound as she landed unsteadily on her feet next to her mother. And within an instant the first blow fell, dropping her to the ground with such force that it left the small child breathless. There was no whimper of pain, no sound at all as her mother slapped her hard across the top of her head, and then pulled her to her feet again with one hand and hit her as hard as she could across the face with the other. To Gabriella, the sound of the blow was deafening. "You're hiding again!" the tall, spare woman shrieked at her. She was almost beautiful, and might have been had there been something different in her eyes, something other than rage running rampant across her face. Her long, dark hair was woven into a loose bun. She was elegant and graceful and had a lovely figure. The dress she wore was well cut in expensive navy silk, and on her hand she wore 2 heavy sapphire rings. They left their mark on Gabriella's face now, as they had done before. There was a small cut on her head, and bright red marks where she'd been slapped, a welt from one of the rings already visible on her cheek. Eloise Harrison slapped the child across her right ear and then shook her, holding her by both arms, shouting into the tiny, devastated face. "You're always hiding, always giving us problems. What are you afraid of now, you little brat? What have you done? You did something, didn't you? Of course you did. Why else would you hide in the closet?" I didn't do anything. I promise." The words were barely more than a whisper as Gabriella gasped for air. The beating seemed to take all the wind out of her, all the life out of her soul, as she looked up imploringly with tear-filled eyes at her mother. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I'm sorry." "No, you're not. You never are. You're never sorry, are you? You drive me crazy all the time, doing stupid things like hiding. What do you expect from us, miserable child? My God, I can't believe what your father and I have to put up with." She flung the child away from her then, as Gabriella slid across the well-waxed floor, a few feet away from her, never far enough, as a blue suede high-heeled shoe kicked her with blinding venom in the small, thin thigh that trembled. The biggest bruises were always on her legs and arms, her body, where they were unseen by others. The damage to her face always subsided in a few hours. It was as though her mother knew instinctively where to place the blows. She'd had plenty of practice at it. She'd been doing this for years, nearly all of Gabriella's life now. There was no remorse, no words of comfort to Gabriella lying at her feet, no effort to apologize or soothe her. She knew that if she got up too soon, it could start her mother's fury all over, so she waited there for a long time, head bowed, cheeks drenched in silent tears, still wincing from the blows delivered by her mother. Gabriella knew that looking up at her with her tear-stained face would only make her mother angrier, so she kept her eyes focused on the floor, as though she might disappear if she lay there forever. "Get up! What are you waiting for?" The biting words, followed by another yank on the arm and one last blow on the side of her head. "My God, Gabriella, I hate you, pathetic child. Look how disgusting you are. You're all dirty. Look at your face." Suddenly, from nowhere, 2 smudges had appeared mixed with tears on the angelic face. Anyone even minimally human would have been in agony seeing her, but not her mother. Eloise Harrison was a creature from another world and anything but a mother. Abandoned by her parents as a small child, sent to live with an aunt in Minnesota, she had lived in a cold, lonely world with a maiden aunt who had rarely spoken to her, and most of the time had her carrying firewood or shoveling snow in the freezing winters. It was the Depression then. Her parents had lost most of their money and had gone to Europe to live on the little they had left. There was no room for Eloise in their world or their hearts. They had lost their son, Eloise's brother, to diphtheria, and neither of them had ever had great affection for their daughter. Eloise had stayed with her aunt in Minnesota until she was 18, and then returned to New York to stay with cousins. She had met John Harrison at 20 and married him 2 years later. She had known him as a child. He'd been a friend of her brother's, and his parents had been more fortunate than hers had been. Their fortune had remained intact during the Depression. Well-born, well-bred, well-educated, though without great ambition or strength of character, John had gotten a job in a bank and met Eloise again shortly thereafter. He was instantly dazzled by her beauty. Eloise had been pretty then, and young, something of a beauty, and there was a coolness about her that drove him into a frenzy. He begged, he pleaded, he courted, he wanted desperately to marry her, and the more he pursued her, the more aloof she was. It took him almost 2 years to convince her to become his wife. He had wanted children almost immediately, had bought her a lovely house, and he was so proud of her he almost crowed every time he introduced her. But it took him nearly another 2 years to convince her to have a baby. She always said she needed more time, and although she never said it openly, having children wasn't really what she wanted. Her own childhood had been so unpleasant, she wasn't particularly attracted to the idea of having children. But it meant so much to John that eventually she relented, and regretted it almost immediately after. She had a difficult pregnancy, was violently ill almost to the very end, and the delivery was a horror she knew she would never repeat and always remember. In Eloise's mind, despite the adorable pink bundle they placed in her arms the next day, it simply wasn't worth it. And it annoyed her right from the first to see how much attention John lavished on the baby. It was the kind of passion he had once had for her, and suddenly all he seemed to think about was Gabriella. Was she warm enough? Was she cold? Had she eaten? Had someone just changed her diaper? Had Eloise seen how sweet she looked when she smiled? He thought it was remarkable how much she looked like his mother. Just listening to him, Eloise wanted to scream every time she saw her daughter. She went back to her own activities rapidly, shopping, going to tea parties in the afternoon, and having lunch with friends. And more than ever, she wanted to go out every evening. She had absolutely no interest in the baby. She admitted to several of the women she played bridge with on Wednesday afternoons that she found the child incredibly boring and quite repulsive, and the way she said it always amused them. She was so outspoken they thought it was funny. If anything, she was less maternal than she'd ever been. But John was convinced she'd come to it slowly. Some people just weren't good with babies, he told himself each time he saw her with Gabriella. She was still very young. She was 24 and very beautiful. He was sure that when the baby started doing more interesting things, she'd rapidly conquer her mother. But that day never came, not for Eloise or for Gabriella. In fact, when Gabriella started crawling everywhere, pulling at things, standing up next to the cocktail table and throwing ashtrays on the floor, she nearly drove her mother crazy. My God, look at the mess that child makes. She's constantly knocking things down, breaking things. Some part of her is always dirty. She's just a baby, Elle, he said gently, scooping Gabriella up into his arms and hugging her, and then blowing raspberries on her belly. Stop that, that's disgusting, Eloise said sternly, looking at him in revulsion. Unlike John, Eloise hardly ever touched her. A nurse they had early on had figured it all out easily and shared her thoughts with the baby's father. She said that Eloise was jealous of the baby. It sounded ridiculous to John, but in time even he began to wonder. Every time he talked to the child or picked her up, Eloise got angry, and by the time Gabriella was 2 years old, Eloise slapped her hands every time she reached out to touch something in their living room or their bedroom. She thought Gabriella should be confined to the nursery, and said so. We can't lock her up in there, John objected when he found her in her room whenever he came home from the office. She destroys everything, Eloise would answer, as usual looking angry. But she was even more so when John commented on what pretty hair Gabriella had, what lovely curls. It was the next day that Gabriella got her first haircut. Eloise took her to Best & Company with the nurse, and when they returned, the curls had vanished. And when John expressed surprise, Eloise explained that having her hair cut was healthy for her. The rivalry began in earnest when Gabriella spoke in sentences and would run down the hall, squealing to see her father. Sensing danger near at hand, she generally steered a wide berth around her mother. Eloise could barely contain herself while she watched John play with her, and when he finally began criticizing Eloise for how little time she spent with the child, a chasm began to grow between Eloise and her husband. She was sick of hearing him whine at her about the baby. She thought it was unmanly and frankly disgusting. Gabriella's first beating occurred when she was 3, on a morning when she accidentally knocked a plate off the breakfast table and broke it. Eloise had been sitting uneasily beside her, drinking her morning coffee, and without hesitating the instant the plate fell, she reached over and slapped her. "Don't you ever do that again, do you understand?" Gabriella had simply stared at her, her eyes filled with tears, her face a mask of shock and sorrow. "Did you hear me?" she shouted at the child again. Her curls had reappeared by then, and the huge blue eyes stared back in confusion at her mother. "Answer me!" "I'm sorry, Mommy." John had just entered the room and saw what was happening with disbelief, but he was so shocked he did nothing to stop it. He was afraid to interfere and make things worse. He'd never seen Eloise so angry. 3 years of anger, jealousy, and frustration were erupting from within like a long-overdue volcano. "If you ever do that again, Gabriella, I'll spank you," Eloise said ominously, shaking the child by both arms until her teeth shook. "You're a very, very naughty girl, and no one likes naughty children." Gabriella glanced from her mother's face, suffused with rage, to her father standing in the doorway. But he said nothing. He was afraid to. And as soon as Eloise was aware of him, she scooped the child up in her arms and took her back to her room and left her there, without her breakfast. She gave her a sharp slap on her bottom before she left. Gabriella was lying on her bed, whimpering when her mother left her to go back to breakfast. "You didn't have to do that," John said quietly when Eloise came back to the breakfast table for another cup of coffee. He could see that her hands were shaking and she still looked angry. "If I don't, you'll wind up with a juvenile delinquent on your hands one day. Discipline is good for children." His own parents had been kind to him, and he was still startled by Eloise's reaction. But he was also well aware that their daughter made her extremely nervous. Eloise had never been quite the same since Gabriella was born.